Is it good?
Yeah.
All right. So do you want to introduce yourself, what you do here at the Jesuit community, and yeah, that's pretty much it. And how long you've been here?
My name is Father Brian Strassburger. I'm a Jesuit priest and the director of Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries. I've been here on the border based in Brownsville, Texas since the summer of 2021. So it's been 3 years now that I've been working on the border. And in October of last year, a little bit less than a year ago, we officially launched Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries, which is our project accompanying migrants here in the Rio Grande Valley.
Oh, great. And could you just give a quick overview if someone were to ask you, what do you do here? Give a quick overview of what the work is you do in Del Camino Ministries.
Sure. The focus of Del Camino is primarily sacramental ministry and pastoral accompaniment of migrants along the border in both the U.S. and in Mexico. So what we do at a most basic levels, we visit camps and shelters on both sides of the border to spend time with migrants in the context that they live and spend their days. And what we do when we visit there is we celebrate Mass as a group of Catholic priests. That's kind of our entry point into these environments. And we've seen that that's a real need for people. A lot of the migrants that we meet and accompany have been traveling for months on a migrant journey and haven't had access to the sacraments during that time. And so for them to see a team of priests, a team of Jesuits to show up at their shelter and offer Mass right there can be a very moving experience. And it gets them access to that space and time for prayer and reflection, for turning to God during the midst of their migrant journey. What we see and encounter is that faith is so important for the migrants. It's a source of strength and hope for them on their migrant journey. And so by offering the sacraments, it's a great way to help feed them in that way. In fact, Pope Francis himself said that one of the greatest neglects of the poor in our world today is the lack of pastoral care. And if we're going to have a preferential option for the poor, that should include a preferential pastoral and sacramental care for them. And so we've really embraced that mission that comes, I think, directly in a lot of ways from the Pope in our ministry here. That might be our entry point, the celebration of Mass, but we also have pastoral conversations with people to hear about their stories, the things that they're carrying on their heart that day, and what's going on in their migrant journey. And through those experiences, we're able to be a conduit of information going both directions. What do I mean by that? I mean, we have trusted relationships with migrants, so when we hear updates about what's going on the border, we can help to share those updates. If there are rumors circulated in migrants' communities that aren't accurate, we can help dispel those rumors as trusted advocates that have direct contact with migrants. So that's information going about policy issues to migrants. From the stories that we hear from migrants, we're able to elevate those issues at a larger level, to share what the lived reality is on the ground, to help highlight concerns and issues that we see and identify that migrants are bringing to us. And we can bring them up to a higher level and help advocate for policy reform and immigration reform, those sorts of topics. So by being there on the ground with migrants on a regular basis, we visit shelters several days a week on both sides of the border. We get to see some of the on-the-ground reality. We get to share information to migrants that can help them in their own migrant journey, and we're able to elevate the causes and concerns that they're raising to us, to other parties.
Okay, awesome. That sounds really great. I wanted to ask, so you become pretty familiar, right, in all this work that you've been doing at the border with that process of coming in as a migrant is. Can you describe for maybe a young man trying to get into the border, over 18, what would the process of him entering the country look like, and how does that kind of deviate to what some of the American public thinks that process looks like?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. The first thing I would want to say is that we don't have an open border. I think sometimes the border gets portrayed that way, and I think that's an error in identifying the reality of U.S. border policy. If I'm an adult single male, for example, if I just come up to the border and say, I'm just going to swim across this river and show up in the United States and they're going to give me a house and a job, that's really just not the reality. In fact, there are a lot of obstacles to entry. So if you're a single adult in the situation you described, really the only way to legally enter our country at the border is by getting an appointment through the CBP-1 app. That's run by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. And you have to download it on your smartphone. You have to create an account with an email address. Then you have to submit advanced information. Once you've done all of that, you can request an appointment any day through that app, which would be an appointment to present at one of 6 ports of entry located along the U.S.-Mexico border. If you get that appointment, you can present at the port of entry and you'll be processed by Border Patrol. They'll review any information that they can find about you, and so you're not guaranteed admission into the country. If you have a checkered legal background, for example, have committed crimes or things like that, you can be denied entry or detained within the U.S. But if everything checks out, you can be released and paroled in the U.S. for a temporary amount of time. Now that the use of this application has a number of obstacles and hurdles to it. One of it is the long wait time. We're seeing people waiting as long as 8 months. So you set out from your home on a migrant journey. Maybe it takes you a month or two to make it from your home up to the U.S.-Mexico border. Maybe you've been robbed along the way. Maybe you've been abused. Maybe you've been kidnapped. And after all of that trauma and difficulty and expense, you're in northern Mexico and you find out that it might take you 8 months to be able to get legal entry into the country. And what we see time and again is people waiting, people with a lot of anxiety and stress in their lives, but trying to wait for that CBP-1 appointment, trying to do things the right way. And so that's one of the anxieties around it. There are also other limitations on the CBP-1 app. Obviously, you have to have access to a smartphone. You have to have access to the internet. So a lot of times people are making decisions of, do I buy a meal for my family today, or do I need to recharge my cell phone minutes so that I can continue to ask for a CBP-1 appointment? Those are decisions people are having to make every day on the border. There are also language. You need to be literate and you need to be able to speak or communicate in one of the limited number of languages that the app offers. So it does offer it in English and Spanish and Haitian Creole, in Russian. So there are several major language groups that are used, but if you're an indigenous migrant coming from a part of southern Mexico or from a part of Guatemala where Spanish is your second or third language and you don't communicate well in it, there are limitations to your use of the app. So we have a number of concerns about the app, but that's the reality. If you're, say, an over 18 single male, come up to the border, the only pathway for you of legal entry into the United States is by downloading this app, asking for an appointment every day, and entering once you've gotten an appointment.
Of course. And with such an extenuous process you're describing, it's no wonder people would try to cross the river out of pure desperation, right? It's not shocking. Can you explain, so the executive order recently switched up a lot of the work you do and kind of, made you take new decisions. It kind of switched up the process as many border policy does. Can you describe how that change impacted the work you do and for how migrants can get into the country?
Sure. In the 3 years that I've been here, there have been several major shifts in border policy where some announcement gets made. It's usually something like an executive order or something that's coming at the federal level, and it has drastic impacts on the migrants that we accompany and see on the border. And so those impacts can take place sometimes from one day to the next, sometimes unannounced. It's not uncommon that we can anticipate some of the changes, but oftentimes there are other consequences that we're unaware of until a new policy gets put into place. So the president's executive order at the beginning of June, we knew that it was coming, that an executive order was coming, and we knew that part of it was going to put further obstacles for anyone who tries to access relief in our country outside of a port of entry. So that's crossing a river in our area, and it's not uncommon that someone may be in a state of desperation or in unaware and ill-informed about CBP-1 and this app that's a legal channel for entry, might cross between a border, not trying to enter undocumented, but literally just trying to access relief in the United States. Cross a river, they'll wait at the side of the road, Border Patrol will come up and they'll say, hey, we're here seeking safety and asylum here in this country. And so then they have to be processed by Border Patrol in some manner because they're on U.S. territory at that point. Another part of the border that might be entering into the desert or crossing a wall or something like that. In our area specifically, there's a river that is the boundary between the U.S. and Mexico. And so the latest law that came into effect, well, the executive order announced announced by the president in June, what it did is it put further obstacles to seeking relief in the country if you enter between ports of entry, like entering through the desert or crossing a river. Even if you're sitting there waiting for Border Patrol, you say, I'm here to claim asylum. The new order says, well, you don't have access to the asylum system because you haven't entered through a port of entry. And in fact, we have a right to detain and expel you either into Mexico or back to your home country, while also giving you a 5-year ban on legal reentry into the United States of America. So very harsh penalties to try to dissuade people from entering between ports of entry. Now, there are exceptions to that rule built into the rule itself. And so there are some populations that could be exempt if they cross between ports of entry. But in general, that is what we knew and anticipated was going to come from this executive order. What we didn't anticipate was that it was also going to close down pathways for people to present at the port of entry without a CBP-1 appointment. So some organizations along the border have been working to identify vulnerable populations and to help them to arrive at a port of entry at a day when they don't have a CBP-1 appointment. In particular, identifying populations that it would be a severe risk to their health or well-being to have to wait up to 8 months for a CBP-1 appointment. What populations am I speaking about? Well, I'm thinking about someone who is being actively pursued by the cartel in Mexico. I'm thinking about populations of people who have been kidnapped and suffered severe trauma and torture. I'm thinking about people who are sick and have acute medical needs and are living in conditions unsafe for their current medical state. And so those populations were ones that were being identified by organizations working on the ground to be able to help them present at a port of entry without having a CBP-1 appointment. And before this law was in effect, since they were cases that were often exempt anyway, they were being processed and released into the United States. Unfortunately, with the announcement of the executive order, so far it has put that work to a complete stop. So no vulnerable cases are being allowed to present at ports of entry. And so a large part of our work was identifying that population and trying to help them get access to relief in the United States. And now ourselves and other organizations are unable to do so.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about how sometimes these migrants don't even know how to enter legally, right? That info isn't accessible to them. Some of them might be even using TikTok to get information or, rumors. Can you explain how difficult it might be for a migrant to access this information, and maybe some examples of times you've seen someone who doesn't even know any better?
Sure, yeah. I mean, access to information is a challenge. Getting the right information is a challenge. I mean, that's not true just for migrants. I mean, that's true for the world today, right? I mean, fake news, so to speak, is extremely prevalent. And so anyone who's engaged in any form of social media is exposed to all kinds of fake news on a daily basis, or news that gets exaggerated or portrayed through a particular perspective and doesn't present the entire reality of a situation. So that's true for our world today. And that truth of our world applies to migrants as they're in their migrant journey. So most migrants are getting their information through social media, which includes TikTok, it includes Facebook, it includes WhatsApp. And so they join groups and they hear information and they have to make their decisions the best they can through the information they get. Migrants themselves know that everything they hear on these networks, just like any of us would know, isn't exactly true, but they try to triangulate that with other sources. Can they also hear personal accounts from people that they know or in their network? They trust that even more. Does that coincide with what they're hearing on social networks? So they'll do their best to try to seek out the most accurate information they can get, but they're not going to be going on the CBP website and looking up their forms and information about what it says about legal entry. They're going to get their information through these social networks. And there some of these social networks, there are platforms for CBP itself. It's got a WhatsApp chat group that people can join and get accurate information from CBP. Of course, that information isn't always as helpful or as quick arriving as what you can get in a world of instant information. And so that's why we're constantly combating with fake information or rumors that spread. So a common rumor that sprouts up every couple of months is a rumor going around that the U.S. border is going to open at this port of entry or maybe along the whole border on this day for some reason, because it's International Refugee Day or something like that. And so that creates a lot of anxiety and interest for migrants who we meet. They're like, is it true? I mean, is the border going to open? Is this going to happen? And most often we're able to dispel those rumors along with the help of many other actors, and people come to realize that this isn't true. But I've seen a couple times where someone fomenting that kind of energy of saying, hey, if we all go together at this time, this is what's going to happen. People in their desperation might believe it and at least say, I want to be there in case something does happen. So then all of a sudden you get a few hundred people could gather together and present at the bridge at the same time. And that can cause some real disruptions. And it's not good for the migrants anymore for the regular flow of traffic in and out of the border. And so those kind of fake rumors can be problematic. And then people have access to information as they're looking for it. So someone in their home country might be saying, I want to find a way to get to the United States. I heard of someone who does that kind of work. They might talk directly to that person. It might not be in that trafficker or Coyote, it might not be in their interest to tell you about CBP-1 and the long wait time. They might say, I can get you into the country within 6 weeks if you pay me $6,000. So you pay that fee, they're transporting you to get to the border. When they get to the border, they've got a boat for you to get across and present yourself to Border Patrol. They're not explaining to you the consequences of that decision, and that the correct way of entry is through the CBP-1 app, because maybe they're not able to charge you as much. And so there's all kind of incentives for everybody along the way to present the information that's most beneficial to them. And migrants, can be exposed to a limited amount of information and not know the entire story, and that can have severe impact on their immigration status in the United States for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wanted to ask, so you mentioned way back earlier when you were describing, the kind of the ministry, the importance of mass. Aside from, maybe like the reason someone, who lives maybe in, the middle of the United States and just goes to mass every Sunday, what is the value of mass to a migrant in this specific, when you give it maybe in a respite center or a shelter? What value of mass beyond the actual mass itself does a mass give? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a great privilege for us to be able to share that sacramental space, to celebrate the Eucharist in the presence of migrants in the context where they are. And it has a big impact on the migrant themselves. The contexts are different and impact migrants differently in the ministry that we do. So for example, when we visit shelters in northern Mexico, we often see a more stable population. There's a lot of migrants who are waiting for CBP-1 appointments, and so they can be there for months at a time. So we get to know the migrants in those shelters. And there's a diversity of people there, and the frequent celebration of the Mass can have a different impact. So some of the people there are just so moved that now they have access to the Mass after not having access to it in any stable way during their whole migrant journey. I mean, there are migrants who, if they're staying in a town for a few days on their way somewhere else, they're going to look for a Catholic church. They're going to pop in. Maybe they're able to catch Mass even before they move on. Now, all of a sudden, they're in a place where a priest is coming on a regular basis to celebrate Mass. And so that can be really moving, and it can really strengthen them in their migrant journey. We've seen other people who, at first, in a shelter where they're staying for a long amount of time, at first are kind of suspicious and like, okay, this is going on, I'm going to sit at the back and whatever. But then over the course of the time we see with them, maybe they move from sitting at the back to sitting at the middle. And then after maybe a couple months, maybe now they're saying some of the Mass responses and singing along and coming up to receive a blessing. Maybe by the end, they're sitting in the front pew and actively involved and asking if they can be one of our lectors. So we have seen that happen, the transformation of someone kind of loosely involved, I'm just kind of checking out what's going on, to saying, hey, I'm really being fed by this. I'm being fed by the reading of the Word of God, by the celebration of the Eucharist, and I want to actively engage and participate in this even more. And people have told us, leaving northern Mexico with their CBP-1 appointment, that this experience has been transformative, and it's drawn them closer to God and encouraged them to be more active in the celebrating with involving themselves in a parish community in their destination. That's kind of the reality on the Mexican side of the border, where we see a more stable population. In the United States, the shelters we visit are very much transit centers. It's migrants are arriving, having been released legally and documented into the United States. They're arranging their travel to arrive at their final destinations where they've got family and sponsors awaiting them. And so they're there temporarily, 2 or 3 days. So we rarely see them more than the one day we show up that they happen to be there. And there, it can be a very emotional response, because some of them, maybe they've crossed between a port of entry, maybe they haven't been waiting at a shelter that we visit, and so they maybe haven't had access to the sacraments for a long time for their entire migrant journey. And now all of a sudden, they're in the U.S. and they've just gone through this very stressful process where they've been processed by Border Patrol, surrounded by people in uniform, English being the primary language, and then having to use a translator to communicate with people, going through these office buildings and spaces that are completely new and completely unfamiliar. And now you've been released into the United States, a country you've never been to before. And so that's a very stressful situation to encounter. To then all of a sudden, within hours of that experience, be sitting in the shelter and priests show up and start singing, playing songs that you know and are familiar with, and start celebrating the Mass that you know and familiar with. It can be a very emotional experience for migrants there. I don't think I've ever been filmed celebrating Mass more than at the Humanitarian Respite Center. You'll see that camera out and it'll be recording as we're celebrating Mass, or even more often, I'll ask someone, oh, what were you doing with that? And they said, oh, actually, I was just FaceTiming or on a WhatsApp video call with my mom back home in Guatemala, and I said Mass was starting. She said, oh, I'd like to join you for the Mass. So I just had the camera on so that she could sit and join us for the celebration of Mass. And so different experiences, I think, in the two contexts, but both continue to reveal to me the importance and value of our sacramental ministry in the work we do here on the border.
I wanted to ask, so there's sometimes this notion from certain people that the people trying to get into our country are here to steal jobs, they're uneducated, lazy. Can you describe some of the population of the shelters that you meet and that you work with? Can you describe, what they're doing, who they are, where they're coming from, why they're in Mexico waiting to enter the U.S.?
Yeah, every migrant has a unique story. Every migrant has a unique story as they come to the U.S. and a diversity of motives that are driving their journey. So it's hard to paint with a single brush. There's a great diversity. But what I see in the migrants that I meet in a company are people who are seeking safety and security from situations of violence, extreme poverty, unhealth, governmental distrust, violent threats against them and their family. There are all kinds of motives like that inspire someone to leave. And what they're seeking then is safety and security, a safe place to live, to maybe raise their family, to get work and a job where they don't feel under constant threat of direct violence done to them or their loved ones, and where they feel like they can provide adequately for their family and their children. We meet a lot of families with young children. We meet a lot of pregnant women who are making this journey. We meet single adults, women and men who have family in the U.S. maybe, who have family back home, who are making this journey. There are people who have evidence of being directly threatened by politicians and political actors and state actors. We have people who have had threats from cartels that control their villages that they live in. A not uncommon story might be, let's say, a Honduran farmer and his wife and their child, their 5-year-old kid, let's say, or 6-year-old kid, and they run a little business out of their home. They do some subsistence agriculture, farming to help feed themselves. If they have any excess, they might sell it in the market. But their village or town is controlled by the local drug cartels, and so they get extorted for some of their profit, and so they have to pay some money to these cartels, who say, in exchange for paying us, we'll make sure you're kept safe, which is to say, we won't do you harm as long as you keep paying us. And those extortion rates might get to a point where the family cannot no longer adequately pay for them and cover their expenses, so they feel like the exploitation is too much. Maybe they're underpaying now all of a sudden. Well, that might be followed with some threats from the cartel. They might take pictures of that young child of the family entering and leaving school and say, if you don't pay us, it's not going to go well for your child. It might be that a family member of theirs has already been murdered and killed by the cartel, and so they know that the threats are not empty threats, but real threats. Maybe they've even presented some of these things to local police who have only passed on that information right back to the cartel, which has increased the amount of threats that they're getting. So any sort of things in this context could be part of the reason. Maybe they're no longer able to provide for their family because there's not adequate work, and the work that they're doing, subsistence farming and trying to generate some income on their own, is being exploited by local cartels, and it gets to the point that they can't sustain themselves and they're now receiving direct threats. Okay, if you create that whole environment, that's going to be a great motivator for leaving that context. And so it's families, people living in that kind of context that are making the decision to migrate and to leave and are coming up to our border. And so what I see is people of great faith, of great values, who want to work hard, who want to do things the right way, many of whom are waiting this long amount of time to enter the country through a CBP-1 appointment because they want to do things the right way. They want to get a work permit. They want to get a job in the United States to help support themselves so that they don't have to rely on the state or the government to help provide for them, and in a place that's safe and secure where they're not feeling constantly under threat for violence being done to them and their family.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, do you have experience being in some of the detention centers where migrants are held once they enter?
I don't. I visit where unaccompanied minors are held, so those centers, but not ICE or CBP detention centers, no.
Okay. And even if you don't visit them, are you familiar with some of the conditions in there that migrants describe to you?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, Border Patrol detention facility they describe as La Hielera, the freezer, because it's notoriously air conditioned, and for migrants from Latin America, it's an unfamiliar environment and uncomfortable one, especially if someone's crossed a river and might be in wet clothing still, and then to be put into a heavily air conditioned holding room. You're often separated, women and children in one place and men in another, and unable to communicate with each other. And you might be in those facilities for a few days before you get processed and released into the country, or moved into a detention facility, or deported. It all depends on your particularities of your situation. So it's not an ideal place to spend time. Detention facilities in the United States for migrants who are being detained for long-term ICE detention facilities are basically like prisons. And so you are treated like a prisoner. The crime you've committed is entering undocumented in the United States, which is a misdemeanor, but you're treated like any other felon who's locked up behind bars. Usually the only difference is the color of your uniform is different. So that's about it. But otherwise you're locked behind bars. You have a daily schedule of when your meals are or your recreation time, or otherwise you have limited access to communication with the outside world. You don't have access to your own personal cell phone, things like that. And so the reality of ICE detention facilities is that it's identical to our U.S. prison system. And most often the ICE detention facilities are housed in U.S. prisons that just have their own dedicated wing or ward for detained migrants.
Thank you so much for that. To switch topics a little bit, we've noticed that recently there's been a big influx of Haitian migrants. Can you maybe describe some of the discrimination they might face for being Haitian compared to a Latin American migrant?
Sure, yeah. Migrant flows from different countries always vary, and it depends on what part of the border you're on. Haitian migrants use the pathway that brings them up through Reynosa and Matamoros, so we see a larger amount of Haitian migrants proportionately to other nationalities than you might see at other points of the border, like in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, for example. And the situation for Haitian migrants is varied as well. There are many Haitians that left the country during the giant earthquake in 2011 that destroyed Port-au-Prince and caused a tremendous amount of damage, and were received temporarily as refugees in parts of South America like Brazil and Chile. And after time, their permissions and visas to remain in those countries has expired, and so they've had to make decisions about what to do with their situation. So we see some of that population having come to the United States because they've got family or friends or contacts in the US. And so if you can imagine a family making the decision to leave Chile or Brazil in the extreme south of South America and journeying across that entire continent, cross into Central America through the uninhabited jungle of the Darien Gap, which is a very treacherous part of the journey. There's no road that can get you through there. And after that, you have to still cross through Central America and Mexico to arrive at the border. And from then, you have to open up the CBP-1 application and start asking for an appointment every day. Haitian migrants face all kinds of obstacles, and language and racial discrimination are two of them. So, traveling through all of Latin America, you're facing a reality that is the Spanish-speaking world. There are Haitian migrants who have lived in Chile for a while and are proficient in Spanish, or they've lived in the Dominican Republic and are proficient in Spanish. There's others that have lived for years in Brazil and are fluent in Portuguese, but that's not the same as Spanish. They might be able to communicate a little bit, but continue to encounter difficulties in communicating. And as Black migrants and asylum seekers, they face discrimination along the way as well. Racism isn't just a part of the fabric of society in the United States of America. It's prevalent in other countries as well. So they experience more frequent cases of discrimination because of the color of their skin. I think that's part of their reality as well. Migrants from Haiti aren't just coming from South America, they're also coming from Haiti. And the situation in Haiti is really devastating. It's basically a failed state. I mean, there's no active government. The president was assassinated 2 years ago. It's controlled by gangs. Our country announced temporary protective status for Haitian migrants just a couple months ago, basically saying now is not a time we could, in good conscience, deport Haitians to Haiti, to their country, because it's so dangerous there and so violent. And so we've paused any deportation of Haitians back to Haiti for the moment, and given a temporary status for people who maybe don't have regular status in the United States, so that they're not exposed to deportation to a place that's unsafe to deport people to. So the stories that I hear on the ground in Haiti are really devastating, of the violence and murder and the lack of control and safety. So it's understandable when you hear it, the more you hear and read about the context, why people might say this is not a safe place for me and my family to be.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, so can you describe a little bit of the advocacy? Because obviously you're serving, but can you also describe some of the advocacy you do to maybe work around these laws, or maybe even try to change them?
Yeah, we do advocacy both at a local and a national level, and we're more focused on advocacy at a local level. So the national level advocacy looks like advocating for policy changes with Congress, with members of the White House who are making policy decisions. And so we participate in calls. For example, we've been on some calls with members of the White House staff to talk about some of the decisions that the president is making and try to offer some of our perspective from the on-the-ground reality that we see and encounter. Participate in some ways at a national level to work for change in immigration policy and for people to be cognizant of what impact the decisions they're making have with the on-the-ground lived experience of migrants. But the best advocacy efforts we do are the on-the-ground advocacy efforts, which is to say collaborating with other local actors, which includes Mexican immigration authorities, it includes U.S. immigration authorities, it includes other local organizations working down here in the Valley to be able to protect and defend and look out for the best interests of the most vulnerable population. So, what that looks like is maybe identifying a case that is extremely urgent and finding different ways that we might be able to get access to help or relief in the United States for that person. There are new obstacles that are making that harder to do, but even in the midst of new obstacles, we're looking for new avenues to be able to help the populations that we know are most acutely in need. And so that means having conversations with local actors to try to advance that conversation to find other pathways or processes that we can use and take advantage of to help the most vulnerable populations. So it's that local advocacy that I think is maybe some of the most important work we do, because it's the most on the ground, and it's about getting to know people, building the relationships locally to be able to protect the populations that are right here.
Awesome. That's really good to hear that, not only are you're providing the charity, but you're also going for that justice, right? So,
Sure.
kind of that like holistic approach to, your ministry. I wanted to ask, so sometimes there's this vision that once people get into the U.S., everything is great, right? And they're coming here and they're taking the welfare and they're living great lives. Can you explain some of the difficulties that migrants still face once they cross the border? Maybe getting a work permit. How do they get to their location? What happens when they get to their location? Maybe their sponsor ditches them, right? Can you describe some of the difficulties they will still face for maybe even tens of years, decades, because they're immigrants?
Yeah, the situation for migrants arriving in our country is fraught with difficulties. There's a sign I saw a picture of that was on the wall between Mexico and the United States, I think around the Tijuana area, that said, "Here's where the American dream ends and the American nightmare begins." So even migrants themselves come to the country thinking everything's gonna work out great, because what they hear are the success stories. Even in migrant networks, the stories that get shared are the success stories. But what we see and encounter aren't just the success stories, it's also all the difficulties that they have to face. So even if everything works out perfectly for you, there's so many hurdles that you have to jump over. So let's say you've waited the amount of time you've had to wait for a CBP-1 appointment and entered with that. Okay, now you're in Brownsville, Texas, and you've got family in, let's say, Pennsylvania that you're gonna go and stay with, and that's where you're planning to head. Well, now you've got to get transportation for you and your entire family. Let's say there's 6 of you. It's you and a spouse and children and a brother traveling together. Okay, now you got to get transportation for 6 people to get from where you are to Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Okay, that's expensive. You're not booking a trip three weeks out, 3 months out. You're trying to book same-day travel. So your ticket prices are extremely high. So maybe you're paying $500 or more per person just to get you to your destination. Okay, you spend all this money in the journey. Now all of a sudden you're faced with a $3,000 transportation bill to get you to your destination. All right, now you've arrived there. What's the first thing you want to do? Now, in that case, I'm supposing this family has somewhere to stay, but that's not true for everyone. There are people who come to our country. It's not illegal or not permitted for someone to come to our country without knowing anyone here. That's not a rule for entry with the CBP-1 app. So people might come into the country and say, I don't have someone to support me, a place to stay. So that's my first priority. Where can I stay? Well, migrants from their whole migrant journey, almost leaving their home country, encounter shelters for migrants along the way. That's very typical throughout Latin America to have shelters for migrants. In our country, that's not typical. We don't have a shelter system for migrants in our country. So what are the effects of that? We see migrants arriving in large numbers unexpectedly in cities like New York or Chicago or Denver, let's say, arriving without a sponsor, without someone that they know, and looking for just a place to stay as they get started, because in their migrant journey, that's what they've done. They've stayed in shelters along the way. And our shelter system is built for a very different population, for people experiencing homelessness in our country. It's a very different population with very different needs, and those shelters are not built to receive families, groups of migrants, maybe non-English speaking primarily, who are coming and hoping to work and just find a place to stay as they find a place to rent. That also speaks to a housing crisis that's true in our country too. There's a lack of affordable housing for Americans, which applies just as much to any migrant arriving here. So a number of hurdles. But let's just say with this family, they've got family in Pennsylvania, they've actually solved that first part of the problem. They've got a place to stay. Well, now they want to work. So they've entered with the CBP-1 app, so they are permitted to apply for a work permit. So they can apply for a work permit. That's another $500 per person, $470 if you apply online per person. So let's say the couple and the brother are all adults and they want to apply for the work permit. Okay, that's almost another $1,500 you're having to spend just to apply for the work permit. And it takes about a month for that work permit to arrive. Okay, you do all that. Now you've spent a month. You spent this $3,000 just to get you there. You spent another $1,500 to get the work permit. Okay, 1 month later, now you get your work permit roughly, and now you're able to start looking for work. You look for work, and now you're having to pay all your expenses, and you've got to figure out how to enroll your kids in school. You've got migrants who are often working multiple jobs. Some of them are in the gig economy, so they're working for DoorDash or Uber Eats, and they're doing that on top of things to try to be able to get and raise money. And that's just, okay, now we're trying to basically pay the bills and live on our own. That's not to speak to your whole immigration situation. If you've entered with the CBP-1 app, you've been given a temporary amount of time to be in the country. Usually it's 2 years. Okay, are you just saying, okay, I'm going to stay here for these 2 years and head out? Or are you saying, no, it is unsafe for me and my family to be back in our home country. We are fleeing from violence. We deserve protections of asylum. Okay, well, now you have to apply for asylum. That's a whole other process that's not begun by entering with the CBP-1 app. And so you have to find legal help or an organization to help you fill out the application. It's a complex application. It's a very thorough and complex application to apply for asylum for every single member of the family. And once you do that, now you're in the separate system of asking for asylum. It's a complicated system to navigate. I mean, as someone who spent 3 years on the border, I still don't understand all the ins and outs of immigration policies. There are immigration lawyers I speak to who say it's well understood in the legal community that U.S. immigration law is only slightly less complicated than U.S. tax law, which is the most complicated, and everyone knows that it's extremely complicated, and all kinds of loopholes and exceptions and things like that. And immigration is only slightly less complicated. So a lot of our immigration policy depends on your country of origin, depends on how you enter the country. It depends on the time when you enter the country. It depends on other laws that go into effect about people from your nationality. There's such a web of complications that it's not as simple as saying we have an open border that someone gets in and then they're here and they're good to go. It's so much more complex than that. And there's so many steps along the way that present a number of hurdles and challenges for people coming to our country.
Yeah. And if anything, it's foreseeable that the average American family couldn't even afford to immigrate to the U.S., right? It's so expensive, it's so difficult. And if these immigration lawyers, right, that have years of experience struggle to understand the laws, how do you expect a non-English speaking migrant to understand them, right?
Exactly.
Can I ask, what do you see differences between some of the shelters and some of the experiences that migrants have? And can you give maybe some different anecdotes of some lucky experiences that migrants have had to get into the country, then maybe some not so lucky ones, maybe where they've been sheltered, they've been kidnapped or not, etc.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we meet people with all kinds of different stories. So you can meet someone who's left their home country. They've safely arrived at the border without having any issues of robbery, extortion, or violence done to them, and they get the CBP-1 appointment in 2 weeks. Yeah. Because a part of the appointments are given out randomly in a randomized lottery. So it is possible to get an appointment any day. There's no guarantee that you have to wait a certain amount of months. You could get it any day. So there's stories of people who have come to the border. They've made the trip in just a few weeks maybe, and they've done it safely without any violence done to them or their families. They get an appointment quickly, and within a few weeks then, they're processed and entered into the United States. And that's a great success story for them. Some of the success stories that I more lean into are people who, even though they have a long wait in northern Mexico, it's a wait that's transformative to them. Their access to the sacraments of the Mass, the time that they spend there is time well spent for them to reflect on their lives and make decisions about the future that they want to live. So, a family of 4 from Venezuela that's in San Antonio now, who would sit in the first row of our Mass every day and participate in it, and just how important that time and space was for them. Or a single adult from Ecuador who came up and had been driving for Uber in his home country, and the cartels wanted to use him to traffic drugs, and he refused it, and so he had to make the trip north, and now has a job and is living in Pennsylvania. And so those are some of the success stories. But even those stories have even those 2 that came to my mind right away, have their stories of trauma, because it's not uncommon for kidnappings. The family of 4 from Venezuela were kidnapped and held in Reynosa for several weeks, and the mother and 2 children were released first, and the husband was held for an additional week. And so that kind of time of trauma and distress is something that's never going to leave them. Some of the stories that you hear that just break your heart are people who have made the migrant journey north. They've traveled through the Darien Gap, which is very inhospitable. They've maybe even seen dead bodies along the way, people who are exposed to the elements, or maybe they've seen someone in one of the rivers that they have to cross get swept away, not knowing what happened to that person who could have drowned or died from that experience. So they've experienced some of those dangers and difficulties. Maybe they've been extorted for money along the way in the route and had to pay bribes along the way. It's not uncommon for even just a regular bus company to charge twice the regular amount for a migrant if they identify someone as a migrant. So just that kind of exploitation that takes place along the way. They get to a place like Mexico City or Monterrey in the north of Mexico. They download the app. They're doing everything right. They get the appointment. Okay, now they've got the appointment for CBP-1. They're going to go up to the port of entry to present on the day that they're assigned their appointment. They make the journey north a day or two in advance, and they get kidnapped from the bus in a very organized way. A gentleman comes on the bus as they've stopped right outside the town and says, I just need to see the documents of everyone on the bus. They show their documents thinking this is normal. They say, oh, okay, you're coming up with a CBP-1 appointment. Just going to ask you to get off the bus and bring your belongings with you. Okay, now they're not sure what's happening. They get off the bus, and the gentleman tells them, you are now being kidnapped by the local cartel. And so give me your phones and all your belongings, and we're going to take you to a secure location where you'll be held. They're brought to that location. They miss their CBP-1 appointment. Their family gets sent photos and videos of them being kidnapped. They're extorted for thousands of dollars per person, which the family is often selling a house, taking out loans, doing anything they desperately can to try to put the money together to release them from their kidnapping. Then they get released and they show up at one of the shelters completely dazed and stunned. Maybe they've been physically beaten. Maybe they've been sexually assaulted. Maybe that violence has been perpetrated in the presence of their own children. And so now, having suffered all of that, they've missed their CBP-1 appointment, and now there's no way for them to access relief in the U.S. except for restarting that entire process all over again. When I see a situation like that, I think, wow, this is just, talk about taking a beating on your spirit. The physical beating, but even just an emotional and psychological beating that you're taking. And we see that, unfortunately, occurring with some regularity. And so that's a situation that we're facing, that migrants are facing as they come up to the border.
Yeah. When we were in Casa del Migrante the other day, a gentleman talked to me talking about the most painful part of being kidnapped was not when he was beaten. It was when they would tell him, instead of beating you, we will beat your brother for your punishment, and how much that hurt him. Can you maybe highlight, you've touched on it a lot, but maybe, to really give it the justice it deserves, some of the trauma these migrants experience, and, maybe how you would help them deal with that trauma, and how, how that trauma impacts them, how they might lose hope for getting into the country. They might just, think, should I give up?
Yeah, it's hard to understate. It's hard to overstate the amount of trauma that migrants go through in the journey, from the exploitation and violence that's done to them throughout the way. And so that's something they're going to carry with them that's going to impact them for the rest of their lives. And so there's nothing that we can do in our brief encounters that's really going to fix that or solve that or provide some full holistic sense of healing. So all we try to do is be a positive presence in their lives that's willing to be a willing ear to listen to the stories that they might have to share about the violence done to them, and to offer them, our words of support and care and concern, to let them know that the suffering that they've had was not caused by God. It was not God's will for them to be kidnapped and violently abused. God was right there with them in the midst of that suffering as well. And that's a principal message to them, that God is walking with you through all this, trying to give you the strength to get through it. And God's weeping for these moments of intense suffering as well. And so are we. I'm often moved to tears in the conversations you're having with migrants as they're reporting, the situations that they've lived through and gone through and the horrors that it entails. And so it's something that can't help but impact you as you hear it, and change what you think about when you hear about migrants coming to our country, maybe the broad strokes that are painted over. When you start to get the concrete stories and experiences, it moves you in a tremendous way. And that's part of what motivates in our work in our ministry, to see how faith can be important, how providing some of that healing touch, being a listening ear, being a voice of trying to communicate some of God's love and mercy felt towards someone can be very important for them. And that's part of what motivates us in our ministry, to help accompany these people in these times of intense trauma in their lives.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's something that is forgotten sometimes, the trauma, because it's so hard to deal with, even someone who knows it exists might struggle to look at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe describe what are some of the things, you obviously have probably so many, but what are some 2 or 3 things that you really wish the American public knew about the border, or some misconceptions they have about the border? Yeah.
Just 2 or 3. Just 2 or 3.
I know it could be a million, but
where do I begin?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that I would say is that the border is probably not what they think it is, and so that's why I always encourage people to come and see, to get a lot your own experience of what's going on in the border, to have conversations with migrants in this context, to see the context that they're living in, to see what the border dynamics are, because any way it gets presented to you is probably inaccurate. It's probably zeroing in on one particular context, on one particular moment, and isn't providing the full context of what happens daily on the border. The U.S.-Mexico border is the most crossed international border in the entire world. There's a ton of traffic going both ways every single day. There are people in the U.S. who go over to visit their grandma and have lunch with her and go to mass with her, or they go over to go to a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment, or go to the pharmacy because it's cheaper in Mexico than the U.S. There are people every day crossing from Mexico to come shopping at stores in the United States, or come over because they work in the U.S. at Whataburger or something like that, and they've got a permit to do so. So there's regular crossings on the border every single day, and that's the vast majority of the crossings that take place every single day. And the border to migrants who are coming is not this open border that just anybody can get in unprocessed. That most people are trying to do, a lot of people are trying to do the right things. A lot of people are acting on inaccurate information, but are doing the best they can to try to follow rules that our country sets up to try to seek asylum and safety. And so they're trying to do some of the right thing. And to hear the stories, the profile of the migrant, it's not, we can zero in and say the migrants that are crossing our border are threats to our country for XYZ reasons. And this is the profile I have of who a migrant is. So coming here and meeting the migrants who are here on the border, you're going to see a very different profile. Now, no profile is exhausted. So the migrants that you meet, there are migrants coming to our country from all different parts of the world, from all different contexts and motives. And so what I would say is what we need is some immigration, some reform, both the border policy and immigration into the United States. For one, we need pathways for legal entry to the United States for people who are seeking safety and security in our country and economic opportunities. There are just too few legal pathways. People think the mantra is get in line, as though there's some line that some poor migrant, some poor Central American agricultural worker, some line that he has to get in that he could be able to enter the U.S. Legally, and just no line exists. The only line that exists now is that CBP-1 App, and that's a temporary permission to enter the United States. And even if you want a work permit after that, it's a separate application process, and any further protection is even more extensive than that. And so I guess the other thing to say, so more legal pathways for people to enter, more understanding of the consequences of our border policy, and understandings of the dynamics and how it benefits our country at large. So yeah, I've kind of spun off a little bit there, but a variety of things that I want for people to be more aware of is, and the complexity of our immigration system. That would be the other thing I would say, is that it's not as simple as people might think. The more you're here and hear stories and learn about the different nuances, the more you see, this whole system is way more complicated than I ever thought it was. And I think having an appreciation for that can really change people's perspective as well.
That's great. Thank you. I wanted to ask something. Do you have any questions or next?
You really covered most of it. But one thing I think could be beneficial to whoever might see this video is it's so moving to hear, like, this is your life's work and it's really tough, incredibly an emotional toll on you as well. The average American probably can't just leave their job and come here. So what are some things, whether in our local community or advocacy, that the average American could do?
Sure, yeah. Anyone can be involved in this issue. Migration is not a border issue. It's something that applies to every community in our country. So I encourage people, if you can come and spend a weekend, take some time and come visit the border, to do so as a way to kind of get an accurate image of what the reality here is on the border. But there's plenty of ways to get involved locally. There are immigrants living in every community in the United States. And so find ways to get involved with the local migration population in your community. Catholic Charities, for example, is always a great place to start. They almost always have an office within Catholic Charities in any given diocese that works with the migrant population. You could get involved teaching English as a second language. You could get involved with housing and resettlement. You could get involved with helping to fill out paperwork for an asylum application or for a work permit or things like that. So a lot of ways to get involved locally. And the more you do so, the more you're going to meet the migrants who are living in your community and get to know them, hear their stories, their motives for their journey, the struggles that they face in communities in the United States. And then I'm going to want to hear from you and hear your experiences and stories, because as we work on the border, that's one perspective. And it's always great when we can hear more of the what's going on down the line, what happens with the people that we meet and know as they end up in the United States living in communities, the challenges they face, and the wonderful opportunities they have access to and otherwise within the country. So there are ways to get involved on a local level with the migrant population. And I'd encourage anyone to look for ways to advocate for migrants legislatively, calling up your representatives and telling that better border policy and immigration reform is a priority. You know, one thing that's universally true is that migrants who enter our country cannot legally vote. So it's not in the interest of any political party to look out for their needs as a high priority. They're looking out for their constituents, which are people who can vote. And so migrants are often political pawns, are pawns in a political game that can be moved around. So when it's convenient, we can say they're good for our country. When it's inconvenient, we can say there's too many of them. And so we can always use them in whatever way that we need to play the political game. And we don't have to make any real policy changes that work out in their interests. Unless voters of the American public start to voice their concern and tell representatives that this is a priority for me, and I'm a US citizen, and I have a vote, and my vote matters, and I care about immigration reform, I care about our border policies. Not enough of our legislators are hearing that, and so it's not a high priority because it's not going to impact whether they get elected or not.
Thank you. And, thinking of more political impact and law and legislative measures, can you describe what, with elections coming up, how could the election possibly impact your work and more importantly, right, the lives of migrants and how they can get into this country and how they can, flourish in their experience as immigrants and not be, disenfranchised?
Well, we'll see. The election is already impacting our work because the current administration is adopting policies that it sees as in its best interest to get reelected. So the current administration is already setting things up and making decisions that are impacting the lives of migrants and the dynamics on the border based on their interest for winning the election. What happens after the election, it's going to depend on who gets elected, but it could go a variety of different directions. It's almost impossible to predict, but ask the candidates themselves, what are their plans for border policy, and see if those align with your own values. And I would say, I don't think what I'm seeing or hearing from any of the major candidates for political office that there's someone that's really looking to make positive reforms to care for migrants coming to our border or the migrants who are already in our country, which makes me concerned about what's going to happen next. But as I've said, in the 3 years I've been on the border, we've seen frequent changes to border policy, and all of them have been at the detriment of migrants coming here. And so I expect, regardless of election results, that to continue to be the case, which means the need for us in our ministry will always continue.
Amazing. To end off, maybe to focus a little bit on you, can you describe kind of how did the founding of your ministry come about? How did you get interested in the border? And you kind of take us through that process.
Ooh, okay, that's a big question.
Yeah, you can be free.
Yeah, so before I went to theology studies to prepare for ordination, I spent a summer working on the U.S.-Mexico border for 6 weeks at the Kino Border Initiative in southern Arizona and northern Sonora, Mexico. And that was a very impactful experience for me. I just finished living in Nicaragua for 2.5 years, working there, learning Spanish because I didn't know Spanish before I started that experience. And spending time on the border, it had a big impact on me, and I saw the tremendous needs that were there. So when I went to theology studies, I decided to make immigration a focus of my theology studies, to approach the classes I was taking through the lens of immigration. And so that cultivated in me an interest in spending time working on the border as a Jesuit and as a priest. So as I got ordained, I was invited by my provincial to come down to Brownsville, to be based in Brownsville, and to respond to local needs. So we met with the local bishop and asked him, what are the needs here? How can we help? And he said, what we want you as a Jesuit community to do is to read the reality and respond to it. And the reality we saw was a reality of a migrant population that was being underserved, including by the church and faith community, which is already stretched thin, providing resources to Catholics here locally. And so we decided to make that the focus of our ministry, is visiting camps and shelters on both sides of the border for the Sacramento ministry and pastoral accompaniment. And so it started just as kind of a trial period, and we spent a couple years here, and we're just seeing how it was going. But we saw the need was great, and that our presence was valuable, and that we were meeting needs that weren't otherwise being met. And that's what led us to deciding to formalize our ministry and our presence here as Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries, taking our name after Nuestra Senora del Camino, Our Lady of the Way. Mary is often turned to by migrants in prayer, asking for her intercession, her protection on their migrant journey, to intercede for them. And so we wanted a Marian image, and Our Lady of the Way is a great devotion of the founder of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius of Loyola. And so we took her, praying for all those migrants on their own way, praying for her intercession over our ministries and the people we accompany.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Father Brian. That is all I have for today. No, truly, it was so great to hear your insights. I remember when we visited in February, just hearing you speak in that little slideshow, I was like, wow, this is amazing, and I want to learn more. So
thank you.
That's why I'm here.
No, thank you for coming back and for expressing your interest in this, and for applying for the grant, for coming down here and having these ambitious projects that you're undertaking. We really appreciate your presence here and the great work you're doing. So thank you to this team too. And
thank you to Max, because he's awesome, doing all the filming, and Miss Delaney for being a great chaperone and really guiding us in our way.
Absolutely.
And on our way,
Yeah.
On our way. Yeah. All right.